You heard of this murder mansion located in New Orleans called the Lalaurie Mansion? Y'all, this place right here was owned by a brutal, crazy, insane woman that was definitely certifiable and did some really twisted stuff that probably should have been in a horror film. Wait, it was. It was in the American Horror Story. But they exaggerated a lot of it, just like most legends do. I'm going to do a little disclaimer. If you are watching this right now and you can't handle the history like slavery, torture, human centipedes, disembodiment, murder, we'll see you next video. It's okay, just go on. Madame Marie Delphine McCarty was born on March 19th of 1787 to a very wealthy, prominent family that had a lot of power and, well, she apparently did too. Delphine would marry 3 times. The first time would be to Don Ramon in 1800, and he was a high ranking officer with the Spanish military. Delphine and Don Ramon would travel all over Spain and enjoy the 4 years that they had together whenever Don Ramon would pass away in Havana on his way to Madrid, and Delphine wasn't around for that, and they said it was a mysterious death. But Delphine would end up having one child with Don Ramon, and her name was Marie, and they would move back to New Orleans after the passing of her husband. Delphine's second marriage would be to a Jean Blanc in 1807 or 1808. I found contradicting stories. And he was a lawyer, a merchant, a banker, and a legislator. So he was a pretty wealthy man. And they ended up having 4 children together. And they lived a happy marriage until, well, he couldn't live no more in 1816 when he passed away from, I don't know, could figure it out. There seems to be a trend going on here. See, the madam here was a looker of the time, and well, she turned many heads, and one of her daughters had an issue with a humpback, and she was going to take her to a chiropractor doctor to try to see if he could fix her hunchback, or she actually had a spinal disfigurement, and she went in there, and then she saw him. The man himself, Leonard Louis Nicholas Lalaurie, who was 20 years younger than her, and they kind of started up an affair. Well, old Delphine here tried to get her daughter cured, but Mr. Lalaurie could not do it. He ended up just getting with the mama. And she got knocked up secretly, and he had left to go on a trip to France. And his brother had to talk him down to coming back because apparently his Laura was getting around. Well, you didn't do that back in the day. It was frowned upon. You had to marry her. So Mr. Lalaurie came back, and he did the right thing, and he married the Delphine. Delphine would purchase the property that is now known as the Lalaurie Mansion in 1831 and finish building it in 1832. And in this establishment, there would live her husband, and 2 children. Mr. and Mrs. Lalaurie, they didn't get along. It was so bad they were yelling at each other, fighting all the time. The neighbors talked about it and would watch. And to the point where Miss Delphine over here decided she was going to leave him because he was being brutal to her, laying down the hard hands. And so she went to court and said, hey, I'm done. And apparently Mr. Lalaurie packed up his bags and he would leave. And this would happen frequently. He would leave and he would come back. He would leave and he'd come back. And they stayed together. Well, just like the times back in the day, the wealthy had slaves, and that they did. And they would mistreat them horribly. Miss Delphine would throw parties, and they would bring in their neighbors and their friends and their family, and people started talking and looking at their slaves and going, they're horrible, they're malnourished, they look tired, something's wrong here. And it was. Word would really get out when the Lalauries would have an accident happen on their property whenever a young slave girl named Leah was brushing Delphine's hair. She hit a snag and she pulled too hard. Well, this just ticked off Delphine, and she took out a whip and she chased her to the top where the girl went on the roof and jumped off the roof to her unalivings. And it said that they buried her in a shallow grave in the courtyard. And this is when the court would come in and just break up everything, because Delphine over here was found guilty and was charged $300, which was a pretty big fine back in the day, and had all her slaves taken away from her and sold. But here's the twisted thing. They sold those individuals to their family members, and this heifer right here bought every single one of them back. I couldn't imagine having to go back to that, thinking I was doing all right and in another place, and then having to go back to hell. But there was another person that also lost their life there. That was a boy, and he was running away from Delphine too, to not get punished by her, and allegedly he jumped out of a 3rd-story window that's now bricked up. But I'm going to tell you this, that's a legend, because this is what the house originally looked at. It was just 2 stories. There's no brick windows. On April 10th of 1834, a fire broke loose in the kitchen, which was not a part of the main house here, by an enslaved lady that was chained to the fireplace in the kitchen. Now, the other rumor is that Delphine set the fire to get the attention to the house so she can escape from Mr. Lalaurie, but I believe the first one. The true version of the story is that Mr. Lalaurie and Delphine and the kids rushed the house to get their valuables out so that the fire wouldn't catch on to the main house. So they got as much as they could, and a neighbor came out that was a judge and said, "Why aren't you getting the other people out of the house?" And pretty much Mr. Lalaurie said that it wasn't worth getting them out, that they were worthless, and was going to leave them in there to burn. Well, this ticked off the judge, their neighbor, and he was like, "Oh no, heck no, we're all going in there, we're getting them out of there, get your people out." Well, that's when Mr. Lalaurie and Delphine and the two kids hightailed it out, and they ended up in France, even though other stories would say that they've never been seen again, but that's not true. The judge and some bystanders busted through the wall and got up to this floor where the chamber was that held all the individuals. They went and saw the most hideous thing they've ever seen in their lives. Torture devices everywhere, people chained to the walls, disfigurement. It was a horrible sight, and they started bringing all the people out into the street, rescuing them one by one. These enslaved people were so messed up and so brutally tortured and disfigured that 2,000 to 4,000 people gathered and was like, "Oh, hell no." And they went to the house and they started taking everything else of value out of it, and they tore the house down, or at least they tried to. That way Delphine and her family could never come back. That's how the people were found allegedly. There was a woman that had her bones broke so many times and bandaged out to where she moved, and she moved like a crab. And Delphine seemed to have loved that. Another person was found chained to the wall, and they had holes all through here, and a spoon was sticking out of one of them, and it was used to stir their brains as torture. Another man had his mouth shown up, but whenever they looked inside of it, what had happened was that there was human or animal feces that had been placed in there, and it was, yeah. One lady had her bones broke over and over and over again in order for her to fit into a small metal cage. And another man was chained up with his eyes open. He was blind because they had taken all the layers off the eyeballs and peeled him back. A man was also found in there, split from here, and they took his intestines out and they wrapped it around his body. This is practically his chest. Allegedly, they liked to partake in science experiments where they would change people's genders and swap genders around the people and see if they would work. And they also tried to create a human centipede out of a woman. And how they did this is apparently what I understood is having a woman on all fours and heads, connected through the back ends. That's insane. Now, with all these tortures being said, it was only reported in the 1940s in a book that all this happened, when the reports in the newspapers are saying that the people that were found chained to the walls were actually just malnourished and looked horrible and were knocking on death's door. So all those crazy things that allegedly happened possibly did not. That doesn't mean this place isn't haunted. Walking in front of this building is said to give off oppressive, heavy feelings to bystanders without even going in the building. Now, people that have been inside have heard screams and moans and chains rattling. They've heard heavy footsteps, and specters have been seen in the windows, and especially a girl sitting on the roof. Cold spots are felt all through this mansion. There's been a lot of paranormal evidence caught here. The mansion is allegedly cursed, and it's said that no one's been able to live 5 years there since the Lalauries owned it. Even Nicolas Cage owned it at one point. The girl that jumped off the roof was actually playing and was going down the curve of the stairwell and fell off and hit her head on the marble and passed away. Miss Delphine herself, well, they all hauled butt to France, and that's where she lived out the rest of her days, and she passed in 1849 from an ongoing sickness. And then after she was buried in France, her son had her body exhumed and put in the St. Louis Cemetery #1. Yeah, she's out there. Have you ever been there? Y'all let me know in the comment section. Do you have a story yourself about this place? Anything you want to add? Let me know as well. And y'all don't forget to follow me for more paranormal stories.